Evet, herkesin bugünlerde sorduğu soru şu: Suriye'de ne olacak? Esad gidecek mi? Cenevre görüşmelerinden bir sonuç çıkacak mı? Taraflar yeniden karşı karşıya gelecek mi? Oturacaklar mı masaya? Bir geçiş hükümeti kurulacak mı? Özellikle insani yardım çalışmaları yeniden başlayacak mı? Akıllarda o kadar çok soru var ki. Fakat Suriye'de durum çok karışık. Peki aslında Suriye'de neler oluyor? Uluslararası toplum her şeye rağmen Esad'ın saldırılarını neden engelleyemiyor? Ne olacak? İşte biz de bu konuda dünyadaki belki de en önemli uzmanlardan biriyle konuşacağız. New York Üniversitesi profesörlerinden Mustapha Tlili yanımızda. Kendisi ayrıca burada New York Üniversitesi'nde Batı ile İslam dünyası arasında ilişkileri geliştirmek için kurulan Diyalog Merkezi'nin de kurucusu ve yöneticisi. Hemen ona merhaba diyelim. Mr. Tlili, thank you very much for joining us.
Sure, anytime.
Uh, Mr. Tlili, Professor Tlili, everybody's wondering now what's going on in Syria because international community was not expecting this. I suppose so because everybody was expecting to Assad go and opposition to win this war. What's going on?
I think both the international community and the main players at the time, if you remember, the United States, Turkey, and others, were dreaming about Syria, were inspired, but they did not take into account the hard facts of politics. Assad was not simply the man Assad or the ruler, he was a whole structure behind him. And if you recall, 2 years ago, more or less, Hillary Clinton, at the time Secretary of State, said, well, in a dismissive way, Assad should go, like if it depended on her or on the United States to say who should govern, who should not govern. And this was, of course, a way of ignoring the facts. And the facts are a Syria that is extremely complex, where so many confessions, sects, ethnic backgrounds, cultural traditions, religious traditions are kept together in a very delicate balance that has existed over the last more than a century, in fact, since the Ottoman Empire, since your own empire. And that, of course, was perpetuated by this Assad family, both Hafez al-Assad and later Bashar. And to say simply that, well, we are going to change all of this, Mr. Assad should go. Well, we have now seen that it was a little bit dreaming than simply, in fact, today, al-Assad is stronger than he was at the beginning.
Yes, this is what the U.S. Intelligence Director Clapper said yesterday. Why do you think that Assad is more strengthened now? Where did the international community what kind of mistake did the international community do?
The mistake was first to ignore the history of Syria and to ignore the hard facts of the Syrian political structure, where, as I said, all these groups were maintained together through all sorts of compromises and through all sorts of interests and games. And that, of course, was at play, and now we are seeing more of that at play. And therefore, the question is now where all of this is going. Clearly.
Yeah, exactly. Where is this going?
Exactly. 2 years after the beginning of this tragedy, we are, in fact, in more tragedies, and the chaos and the catastrophe is there. Now,
It's still going on. People are dying, and Assad is still using bombs and.
Absolutely, people are dying. Now, all Syrians, whatever side they are on, whether they are pro or against, are suffering. And the question is what to do. Now, as a political analyst and political observer, I see only more of the same for quite some time, because as long as the players are not exhausted.
Do you think that nothing will be changed in the near future?
I doubt it. I doubt it because as long as the idea of compromise has not made its way to impose itself on the negotiators, on the players and so on, as long as each one of the two sides persists in demanding the total submission of the other side, we are not going to go anywhere. So the question is there a way of finding a solution with al-Assad and not by dismissing al-Assad regime? Well, maybe that's the only way to look at things in the future. And politics is the art of politics. It is not a science of the absolute. It is a matter of compromising with realities, finding the best way to keep interests playing together and not against each other. And the question is now how to find that new formula. Maybe Lakhdar Ibrahimi, who had the experience of so many international tragedies from South Africa to Cambodia, he's a man of wisdom, he's a great thinker.
Even he was not optimistic.
And even he's not. But I still trust that at one time, with his experience, with his knowledge precisely of the complexities of Syria, he might be able to develop something. But it's not going to be tomorrow, it's not going to be after tomorrow. It's going to take more tragedies until everyone is exhausted. And my hope is that the regional players, whether they are directly in the region or on the periphery of the region, my hope is that they gain now some wisdom from what has happened and see to it that compromise plays its role finally in this tragedy.
But how will we go there? What can we expect from Geneva? Because the international community and United States and Russia were successful about bringing the sides to the table. Yes, they were on the table, but every side talked about their own issues. They didn't accept. The opposition wants Assad to go. Assad doesn't want even to talk to the opposition. He says he wants to stay in power. So how can we get a solution without, for instance, military intervening?
Military intervention, of course, would be catastrophe, even more catastrophe than, and I don't think that we should even think about it. On the one hand. Second, now, when you say that, well, after the opening of the Geneva II, finally nothing happened. Negotiations take time. Remember Vietnam, between the United States, the ritual was almost the same. You meet the first time, nothing happened. Second time, nothing happened. The third time, nothing happened. And then maybe behind the scene, something can be developed. And one would hope that that is the case. Remember the Algeria war between France and Algeria. It took 5 years of behind-the-scenes negotiations, but it took men of wisdom like de Gaulle, and on the other side, some of the Algerian revolutionary leaders at the time, finally behind the scenes to find ways of compromise. So let's hope that, again, with regard to Syria, that while we have the big show at Geneva, behind the scenes, men and women of wisdom would finally, now that they are facing each other, they know each other, they have decided that they should talk to each other, develop trust in each other, and start maybe with few trust-building gestures.
I think this is the biggest problem, trust building.
Exactly. So if we start with small things to build trust so that they finally realize that if you destroy Syria, they are all going to lose. But if they find something in common, then maybe they will work for it.
But Assad is existing to stay in power. So isn't this a deadline for the dead end for the negotiations?
Well, it looks that the reality is this reality that we are now seeing, that al-Assad is more powerful today than he was at the beginning. And
whose fault is that?
All of us. All of us, the international community, the main players in the region are at fault because they thought that this was a simple matter. You see, in the inspiration of the so-called Arab Spring, seeing that dictators here and there were falling, from Gaddafi to Ben Ali in Tunisia to Saleh in Yemen and so on, well, this is the next, like if it was a domino theory that everyone will be affected.
That was not the case.
That was not the case. As a matter of fact, today our eyes are open when the so-called Arab Spring is an Arab disaster. We see what happened in Libya. It's total chaos. We see what's happening in Egypt. We see what happened to Yemen. And we see what's happening in Syria. And maybe the only exception so far is Tunisia. So this is also part of the problem, that in the lyrical mode of the beginning of the so-called Arab Spring, we all thought that everything will be possible.
I want to ask another last question. The Islamist groups, Al-Qaeda, ISIL, and they are all fighting against Assad, and they are fighting between them. So it looks like the United States prefers Assad to the Islamist groups.
Of course, you have to prefer lesser evil than evil. And particularly when the United States saw what happened in Afghanistan by furthering Al-Qaeda against the Soviet Union, then after that we had Al-Qaeda attacking the United States, and we had the tragedy in New York and others. And today we are seeing what happens when you open the door to all the extremists. The question is then, is it in the interest of the United States to have at least someone you can talk to, and who has a tradition of...
He's already on the table.
Absolutely, yes. And I do not have any particular information, but from what I read, and which is public information, I imagine that the security services of the United States and the security services of Syria are working together. This is quite normal and natural to arrest, to put an end, or at least to serve as an obstacle to the takeover by extremist Islamist groups.
So last question.
Yes.
What are you expecting now? I know that this is a difficult question, but what should we expect? Should we expect more from Geneva?
I think what we might expect is two things. First, a worsening of the war. Why? Because history, I have no other source of knowledge in this field than history. And history tells us that as long as the two sides are not totally exhausted, they are not going to come to a real bargaining. And so, because each one of them still imagines that he can defeat the other. So we will see more tragedies, more suffering of the people of Syria, a bigger catastrophe as far as... so that is one thing. Second, I would imagine that behind the scenes, now that the two sides have been talking officially in Geneva, they will be meeting behind the scenes, without the media, without the big flash of televisions and people like you going after them and so on. And eventually, they will develop some sense of their common interest. But this, in my view, will take a long time. We are not at the end of the nightmare. I think we are just somewhere in the middle of the nightmare.
Professor Tlili, thank you very much for joining us. We hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Evet, New York Üniversitesi'nden Profesör Tlili ile konuştuk. Suriye'deki son durumu, çok önemli şeyler söyledi. Batı'nın en büyük yaptığı hata tarihe bakmamak dedi. Bundan sonrası için önümüzde iki seçenek var. Ya işler daha kötüye gidecek ya da masadaki taraflar anlaşacak. Ama şu anda ortasındayız sürecin dedi. Bu da çok önemli bir tespitti. Buradan aktaracaklarımız şimdilik bu kadar. Söz tekrar İstanbul'a.